Welcome back to Dissecting Lavos, where we do a deep dive into the many aspects of the Chrono Trigger universe's most dangerous life form. Now, it's been a while since the first video, in which we discussed his size and composition, researching, among other things, the shell's durability, whether or not the creature inside is the true Lavos, and a rough estimate of his mass from planetfall all the way up to his eruption site in 1999 AD. Despite the fascinating conclusions we made, Lavos' scale and what he's made of are not only topics with the least amount of in-game reference, but also, perhaps, the least interesting. In this episode, we're going to explore three aspects of Lavos that I feel are intertwined in incredibly significant ways: his evolution, life cycle, and origin. The purpose of this analysis would be to build a somewhat reasonable chart for Lavos' many forms, from birth to, presumably, his final defeat. And so, let's begin. In the previous video, I mentioned my conclusion that the cracker enemies, the oozing eggs that fall from the ceiling and cascade from above us on Death Peak, are perhaps Lavos ovums that have only just been conceived. But I never really touched on how I came to that conclusion in the first place. If you've played through the game enough times and paid a decent amount of attention, you'll notice that the egg-style enemy sprites only appear in 2300 AD, when Lavos has already destroyed the planet. Now, you might be saying, well yeah, but there aren't any proto-style or bugger enemies in any other era either, and you'd be right. However, it wouldn't make much sense for those enemies to appear at a time before they were created. Eggs, as far as I know, have existed throughout history, however, and virtually every other biological baddie sprite that appears in 2300 AD also appears in other time periods, or on the Black Omen. To this point, I can't help but mention how strange it is that the eggs never appear in places it would make sense for them to be, such as two specific locations that have the word nest in them, namely the Dactyl Nest and Beast Nest. But I digress. And no, I didn't mean to rhyme there. It was just an accident. I'm sorry. Anyway, the only other place we see the eggs are the Eggdurs that crawl through the sewer access, which is located, conveniently, in the shadow of Death Peak. Although they're purple rather than orangish, I feel the cause of this discoloration is likely due to the sewer environment itself. As we'll discuss later, Lavos has the ability to splice DNA within himself and adapt. It's not out of the question to think that his spawn would inherit this trait, and innately change to match the subterranean tunnels of the sewer access, eventually reaching the mainland, where the last of humanity ekes out a meager survival effort. So, that out of the way, as we attempt to fill in the gaps of Lavos and his spawn's life cycle, we can reasonably assume that the evolutionary chain begins here. Now, the only form that makes any sense to discuss from this point is the very literally named Lavos spawn enemies that we find on Death Peak. This is where they begin to mature and become more well-equipped for the duty of draining the rest of the planet's energy. As the Mother Brain computer tells us, it is this form in which they will likely leave in search of other planets to sustain them, a practice which seems instinctual, and suggests that Lavos is one of a species rather than a progenitor. But more on that later. An interesting point to mention, despite the fact that they are much smaller and obviously weaker than their mother? Father? They aren't exactly weak. Their needle spin attack does a decent chunk of damage. Merely sighing, which is arguably super adorable, and you can fight me on that, can put a party member to sleep, and his breath is a chaos blizzard that causes confusion. That's not even considering the durability of the shell. If you've ever tried to defeat the shell first, which requires some decently high levels, you'll know what I mean. Not only does every attack aimed at it result in a counter-spawn needle, it takes a lot to defeat it, and your only reward is to see the hilarious face sprite remain on screen to continue fighting the party. It might be a stretch to say so, but the fact that this can happen may prove just how hardy this form is, and how, even without its body, it can continue to thrive. We also fight a Lavos spawn on the Black Omen, which seems to have been warped there from the destroyed future and is much stronger than the ones we encounter on our Time Egg quest. This seems to be a more mature spawn, gaining a bit more control of its innate magical ability, and attacks such as Dark Bomb and Water Rise, and also appearing to do things we might consider to be very Lavos-y. basically recreating in battle a miniature Day of Lavos with Destruction Zone and a spawn needle that hits the entire party. If what was discussed in our first video holds true, Lavos was just a spawn when he crashed into the planet, albeit perhaps a more matured spawn akin to the one on the Black Oak, likely due to the time he spent traversing space, which accounts for the signature cry we hear after the impact. For now though, I think securing the Lavos spawn in this spot goes without saying, as most of them, like the eggs, appear on Death Peak not far from their birthplace, further suggesting that they are still very young by giant space tick standards. The next time we see Lavos is in the Ocean Palace, seemingly full grown, and when he erupts to obliterate Zeal, his overworld sprite matches that of the 1999 Day of Lavos video. I feel that perhaps this is the final externally visible form of Lavos' basic maturity line, and all forms after are varied based on circumstance, which we'll discuss shortly. When the party encounters this form in the final battle, or having beaten Queen Zeal on the Black Omen, Lavos also exhibits the ability to draw upon powers from various enemies found throughout your journey at a whim, possibly due to advancing his inner DNA splicing trait. Finally, having exhausted every option to defeat the party, he reverts immediately to what he has seen eliminate you before, his base form and attacks, until his face is finally destroyed. This particular moment is what sparks the discussion on whether or not the shell itself is just a sort of spacesuit for Lavos, but we'll get to that in the next section. That being said, this form of Lavos slots in perfectly here, completing the basic progressionary line from infant and adolescent to quote-unquote adulthood. Now, this is where things become complicated. There are a few forms Lavos takes depending on very specific environments and events from here on out, and they must all be considered moving forward. Let's begin with Chrono Trigger and the Lavos Core. First, in reference to the Lavos Core we fight after first penetrating the shell. As I've said before, I don't really consider this to be the true form of Lavos in the sense that the outer body is merely a vessel. The creature within the shell does not appear to be independent of it, after all, and looks to be biologically fused to it through tendrils. In regards to its appearance as being humanoid, we can surmise that this is a result of the DNA it has absorbed from humans throughout history, and that, had Lavos crash-landed on a separate planet, perhaps the being within would have looked much different. Also, the fact that it seems to have robotic features, such as the good old Doors of Doom nipple lasers, would suggest that he absorbed even some form of power from cybernetic life forms like Robo, but that might be speculating a bit too far. In any case, I think that, yes, the being did develop its appearance due to human DNA, and is an intermediary stage that will ultimately lead to his final form in Chrono Trigger. Regardless, after the party defeats it, the true final form of the Lavos Core materializes from its center. Judging by the preamble from Luca, Magus, and others, this is the perfect evolution that Lavos has been trying to achieve throughout the game, and maybe throughout all of its existence, but we'll get to that in the origins section of our analysis. He appears to finally be an entity free of the shell here, and has even split himself into 3 pieces. The left bit, which heals the central part, drains MP, and voids status protection. The central bit, which has the ability to warp time and employ differing attacks and skills based upon it. And finally the right bit, which, despite the humanoid Lavos' imposing form, is the actual Lavos Core, wielding the ability to revive the other 2 parts with active life, and also dictates when the party can actually harm it by constantly fluctuating its defenses. Owing to its patient absorption of the planet, it has mastered magic and physical power, busting out the ultimate, most damaging attacks of each in the form of Grand Stone and Dreamless. But yes, it truly seems that Lavos has pushed its power level beyond that of anything in the known universe at this point. Now, for a bit more crazy theorizing from your friendly neighborhood two-tone. This form of Lavos is the culmination of all DNA throughout history being spliced and manipulated to perfection. Why, then, is it not in this form when we first arrive at the innards of Lavos' shell? One theory I have is that Lavos would not have reached this pinnacle of its evolution had the party not attempted to defeat it. When we defeat the first form of the Lavos Core, I feel that we weren't exactly doing enough damage to destroy it, but rather, the battle goes on long enough for Lavos to extract the last bit of data it needed, that of Chrono and Company, to achieve this evolution. Think about it. You have been ripping back and forth through time, mastering the temporal arts from the beginning of the game, and growing stronger and stronger from your experiences, while Lavos slept beneath the planet's crust. Now, it could be that we just happened upon Lavos the moment he was about to reach his final form, but that would be awful convenient timing, don't you think? While I don't believe Lavos was waiting for us, I do believe that he would have simply continued to exist in the middle form, had we not come along with our time travel tempered skills and abilities for him to feed off of, considering that we do not see Lavos doing anything to directly affect time-based events until we fight him in this form, and suddenly he's able to time warp. Again, although fun, that might be a little too crazy land even for me, but it's interesting to say the least. Either way, the Lavos Core fits here in this evolutionary line, and finalizes the original Chrono Trigger's progression of his life cycle, as we triple kick and luminaire the crap out of it until its defeat. Now, for all of my analysis up to this point, I've gone off of my own extensive knowledge of the games and what I remember. But even the biggest fans of the Chrono series have trouble sorting out the events and plot once Chrono Cross's convoluted story enters the discussion. Luckily, again, thanks to Chrono Compendium and the tireless effort of the community there, many articles have been written in reference to Lavos beyond the end of Trigger, and I'll be referencing a bit of those articles here in an attempt to avoid confusion. To move on to the next in Lavos' many evolutions, we can't avoid the subject of the darkness beyond time, an anomalous location existing outside of time and space itself. This is where lost or misplaced timelines wind up should history be changed to affect the Keystone timeline, which is a discussion for a whole different video. The next stage in Lavos' evolutionary path branches off due to some specific events taking place. 1. Lavos' defeat at the hands of Chrono & Co. in 1999 AD, sending him to the darkness beyond time, and 2. Shala being swallowed up after the Ocean Palace disaster and transported to the darkness beyond time as well. Just as Surge was in Chrono Cross, it is believed that Shala was an arbiter for the Frozen Flame when it existed in Zeal, lending credence to how she was somehow able to raise the power of the Mammon Machine on her own, and possessed greater magical strength than her mother. As is stated in Chrono Cross by Balthasar, an arbiter will gain, quote, extraordinary powers by binding with the new seed of destruction, the Devourer of Time, unquote. This suggests to us that it is the destiny of an arbiter to merge with Lavos and create a new life. Before we talk about the Time Devourer, though, we have to address perhaps the intermediary life form we see in the Dreams epilogue ending from the DS release of Chrono Trigger. Here, we can see that the process of Shala's binding to Lavos has already begun, and Lavos has gained the new ability to feed upon the dreams and memories of people throughout time and space, or perhaps only the ones from the timelines that were banished to the darkness beyond time. Shala, although trapped, is awake and aware of what is happening at this point, unlike later when she is comatose and encased in the chrysalis-like cocoon upon the Time Devourer's shell. It is unknown how Lavos achieved this form, and, as stated previously, might be just a halfway point to the being he would eventually become. That being said, let's place the Dream Devourer here, and move on. Now for maybe the most complicated of Lavos' many forms, and, incidentally, his final one. When Lavos was defeated by Chrono & Co. in 1999 AD, he was discarded to the darkness beyond time, as we've already stated, and began to merge with Shala, who was also thrown there following the second Ocean Palace disaster, the one in which we take part in Trigger. The Dream Devourer, perhaps due to gorging on dreams and memories, started its latest transformation, born of hatred and revenge from being defeated. This sort of sets a precedent that Lavos has higher emotions, and could be an argument for his actions being far more well thought out than simply instinctual. The more I think about this, the more I realize that maybe he attained these emotions when he transformed into the final Lavos Core, and what was missing from his evolution was the integration of human desire and ambition, which, in turn, gave him purpose. That is, of course, unsupported by a dialogue in either of the games, however. Either way, it is implied in Cross that Lavos merged with Shala out of a desire to consume all space-time in an act of vengeance. This next part is where things get choppy for anyone trying to summarize events in Chrono Cross, but I'll do my best with the help of the Compendium's many articles on the subject. As a result of Lavos' defeat in 1999 AD, the black portal in which Balthazar was enveloped sent him not to the destroyed future, but to the new future that was allowed to exist thanks to the efforts of Chrono Co. There, he built Chronopolis, a facility hidden in the empty sea of El Nido which studied the effects of time travel and was powered by the frozen flame itself. Thanks to the computer he built, Fate, he was somehow able to view timelines and learn of Lavos' defeat and the alternate future that was averted. Somehow, he was also able to discover Lavos' continued existence in the darkness beyond time, and his merging with Shala, during the counter-time experiment, whose purpose was to give the facility and Balthazar complete control over time. The flame went out of control due to Lavos' influence when awakening at the Ocean Palace. Perhaps foreseeing his own defeat at the hands of Chrono Co., Lavos used the flame to drag Chronopolis from the future to the El Nido Sea of 12,000 BC, in the hopes that its presence there would cause enough of a detrimental effect on time to avert his coming defeat. To counterbalance the existence of Chronopolis in a time it didn't belong, the planet, or entity as it is widely believed to be, pulled Dinopolis, a stronghold from a future in which the Reptites defeated the humans in prehistory, back from an alternate future. A great war in 12,000 BC erupted between the forces of Chronopolis and Dinopolis in the Sea of El Nido, in which the humans prevailed, and split the dragon god who ruled over Dinopolis into the lesser dragons we see in Chrono Cross. Now, for what this has to do with the Time Devourer, it would seem that long before the events of this war in 12,000 BC, Lavos had already consumed the discarded timeline in which the dragon god existed in the darkness beyond time, increasing his power. As we know, the intended ending of Chrono Cross sees Surge using the cross to free Shala from Lavos, where she fully recovers from her stasis and is able to use her powers to create an ideal timeline, with parts of each of the split dimensions. It's unknown what events are considered ideal and exactly what this new timeline looks like, but that is a whole different discussion. As for Lavos, this last and final form of his has many difficulties and questions attached to it. For instance, I believe that the Dream Devourer and Time Devourer were never meant to be Lavos' ultimate goal. As referenced in another compendium article, Lavos' quote-unquote purpose is to extract all of the energy of a planet and then send its spawn to do the same elsewhere. Becoming a being that would essentially eat all of time and space would be precisely counterintuitive to this goal. The Time Devourer is far more likely to be an aberration, a mistake brought on by many coinciding factors, and was not intentional in the sense that it was planned from planetfall. But, as with most mysteries involving Lavos, we may never know for sure. Either way, the Time Devourer obviously slots into this part of the evolutionary chain, and finally gives us a full picture of all of his forms and iterations across the series. Now that we've finally done that, we can talk about our intergalactic space tick's potential origins. Regrettably, this may be the single least talked about subject in the Chrono series, and there is precious little to reference about it, forcing us to speculate just based upon theories that are essentially groundless. But that's not to say these theories have no weight at all. As stated in Chrono Compendium's article compilation, Lavos Points of Interest, two possibilities are taken to be the most likely. Either Lavos was created by a sentient race, a biological superweapon intended to reach genetic perfection and destroy planets, or he emerged naturally. The first theory involving his creation is a somewhat silly one in my opinion. As is also stated in the article, the idea of Lavos being sent off to conquer worlds is counterproductive, as he leaves nothing but destruction in his wake, sucking up every natural resource and leaving the planet uninhabitable. I fail to see how any race would benefit from such a creature. There is the theory that perhaps Lavos grew too powerful and broke free of its creator's control, but I feel like that is stretching an already stretched argument. The second theory is much more cohesive and follows closely to Occam's razor. It would make sense that Lavos is simply one of an entire race of beings that are parasitic to planets and their inhabitants, and maybe the Lavos we fight traveled the galaxy from another doomed planet, having been birthed by a similar being to himself as he later does on Death Peak. This process, as we see, would have likely continued if it hadn't been for our interference, further supporting the idea that his devourer forms were a glitch in his evolution, rather than an intended result. A quote from the first part of the article that I very much subscribe to is that Lavos may be the ultimate evolution of a virus. Again, both of these theories are heavy with speculation, but I would not be surprised to find out that either were true. All things are possible with Lavos, and nothing is off the table. Well, I've reached the apex of my sanity in writing this script, and I probably made a lot of mistakes along the way that you lovely people of the internet will likely not let me know about. I really want to thank those on Chrono Compendium who edited, compiled, and contributed to all the articles referenced in this video. Gray Lensman, Jossie Rossi, and of course, Zeality, who does a ridiculous amount of work for the site. And, of course, all of the nameless souls who discuss these topics into the dirt to make it happen. Despite how much effort I put into this one, and the ground covered, there are endless more oddities surrounding Lavos that we have yet to touch upon. When we return to the Dissecting Lavos series, we'll dive into one of the most intriguing and maddening of these oddities. Whether or not Lavos' actions in Chrono Trigger were a result of careful planning and sentient thought, or simply the instincts of the universe's most dangerous parasitic threat. Until then, I'll see you guys next time.